obscure and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I am Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And this is episode 12, which concludes our current series, Rock and Reel, Cult Music Films of the 60s and 70s.
Today we'll be talking about Rock and Roll High School from 1980, directed by Alan Arkush, featuring the world-famous Ramones.
It's 1980. Welcome to Rock and Roll High School.
Rock and Roll High School?
Do you want to stand there and hold my hand? Tell me, baby, if you'll understand. Do you want to stand? Do you want to stand under the moonlight?
I am Miss Togar, and I am the new principal of this school.
They tried to stop their music, but the kids got wrecked and rocked the school.
I just talked to the chief of police. He's going to storm the building.
Rock and Roll High School, the school where the students rule. Could your school be next?
So, as we said, Rock and Roll High School from 1980, directed by Alan Arkush. This film was produced by Roger Corman, who, of course, is known for being a producer of kind of cult movies and independent cinema from the 60s into the 70s. He's known for jumpstarting careers of directors such as Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, and many more. Also very well known for working with Jack Nicholson, who, as we've discussed previously, seems to pop up everywhere.
Right.
However, it does not pop up in the movie we're talking about today.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. It would have been an interesting little performance. I'm sure he could have been worked in nicely.
Right.
So basically what we're looking at here is a film that's set in 1980 at a school called Vince Lombardi High, named after the famous Vince Lombardi, first head coach of the Green Bay Packers, who won the first Super Bowl. Kind of a random reference there. But they keep losing principals and are nervous because of the students' love of rock and roll and their extreme disregard from education. So they hire a new principal by the name of Miss Evelyn Togar, dun dun dun, played by the wonderful Mary Woronov, who we'll talk a little bit about later.
She is wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely one of my favorite actresses, probably ever. But this new director, Miss Togar, is kind of a Nazi-esque dictator of a principal who tries to get the students to stop listening to their rock and roll music, but a rambunctious student by the name of Riff Randall, played by P.J. Souls, who is the biggest Ramones fan at Vince Lombardi High, or perhaps in the world, brings the music to the school and gets tickets for all the other students to get them to the show. And then, chaos ensues and rock and roll goes crazy.
Because rock and roll is evil, apparently.
Yes, it's the devil's music, as they say.
As they say. What were your, what are your first impressions of when you saw this film? Was it the first time for you to see it?
Yeah, so this was the first time watching this one for me. I had a lot of fun with this film. I mean, obviously, it's not a super, super deep, introspective, I don't want to say not thought-provoking, because I think it is thought-provoking, but maybe not necessarily for the reasons that were intended. I think it's maybe more thought-provoking in retrospect, looking back at the journey that rock and roll took kind of before and after the watershed moment that was 1980. I mean, you got to think 1980, that's kind of right after, I believe Off the Wall, Michael Jackson's Off the Wall came out in 1978 or 79. We'll have to check that date. AC/DC's Back in Black came out in 1980. So this is, Motley Crue released their first album in 1980, I believe. So this is a big kind of turning stone moment as we're moving into kind of the post-Led Zeppelin, post-70s moment for rock and roll, and then moving into the consumerism and pop of the 80s. So it's kind of interesting seeing this moment where you have all these kids. This feels to me like one of the last big, rock and roll sticking it to the man moments before things kind of started going in a very different direction into the next 2 decades and 3 decades to follow.
Right. I mean, to some extent, all films are a product of their time, but I do feel like this one in particular, very much a product of its time. You have Roger Corman, you have the Ramones, these two giant legendary, personas coming together. It all just makes some sort of weird sense in a way. That's what I thought when I was watching it. It's like, this shouldn't work, but it kind of does. Just all these things coming together and just the timing of it. And apparently the timing was a bit up in the air. I was reading about it. Roger Corman, he originally wanted to make Disco High School. So
Disco High
that's
School. That would have been a very different
that's
movie.
yeah, that's what it would have been, if they had made it earlier. But I guess it took longer to make for whatever reason. And then
Well, they kind of made that with Saturday Night Fever,
yeah,
a little
yeah,
bit,
right.
but
Not as cheap, I guess. But
not as cheap, not as cheap, and not as wacky. I would imagine
right,
as a Roger Corman Saturday Night Fever would have been.
definitely. So so I guess the timing of it was like, oh, rock's big now, so let's who's big? The Ramones. All right, let's throw them in there. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, but like I said, it just makes some sort of weird sense. It's hard to explain. But as you said, compared to the other films we watch, this is obviously much more of a silly, all-out comedy than the other ones. Not quite as existential. I noted that it's more Zucker Brothers or National Lampoon than avant-garde.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um,
It,
there's like
it definitely had that influence. Obviously, it pulled kind of from National Lampoon, who was popular at the time. But
mhm,
I also felt that it's a kind of interesting considering it, which is why I say maybe it is thought provoking to a certain level. Um, it kind of preceded like the John Hughes '80s movies, and something like, but also kind of in the more art house, something like a Heathers,
mhm,
or maybe a Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Not to call them art house, but maybe a little more,
mhm,
little less aimed at a commercial audience, and a little bit more maybe aimed at an emotional, character-driven,
mhm.
dark comedy kind of core. But
Sure.
kind of the coldness that those movies have, like the characters are. It doesn't really have any sentimentality in this movie. There are a
No,
few little moments, but
not at
other than
all.
that, it's really about like the rock and roll and
Yeah.
being badass. There's no characters get their heart broken, but
Mhm.
ultimately the cure for that is rock and roll. It's not
Yeah.
finding true love.
It's extremely lighthearted. I think the
Hmm.
closest we get to feeling any kind of emotion might be when, I don't know, at least for me, the scene where when she's just kind of like pining about the Ramones, PJ Souls, when she's I can't remember her character right now. Whatever her
Riff
character's name.
Randall. Riff
Riff Randall.
Randall.
How could I forget that? Riff Randall, when she's on her bed, pining away about the Ramones, and then there's that cool sequence, or it's actually my favorite part in the movie, where she imagines them being in the room with
Mm.
her and singing to her, "I want you around," and I don't know why that just, I don't know, speaks to me for some reason. It's just like that kind of like longing when you're like a teenager and stuff like that. And but other than that, yeah, it's just a very silly movie. There's tons of sight gags,
Mhm.
abundance of like non sequitur jokes and stuff like that. That's why it reminded me of the Zucker Brothers a little bit, like
Yeah.
airplane kind of, that
Hmm.
kind of humor, which
Definitely.
I do enjoy. I mean, there's a place for that.
Hmm.
Um, I
Yeah.
guess
I
it
feel.
was. Yeah, sorry. What was it?
Sorry. Go ahead. I feel like what helps this one in that regard in making it not too just zany
Hmm.
is the rock and roll.
Yeah,
Like at its core, this is
yeah,
a music movie, and
yeah.
that sometimes the pure comedy, silly movies kind of you watch them and they're funny when you watch them, but once you've seen the jokes once or twice,
Hmm.
they don't hold up. Whereas this is a movie. I mean, I've only seen it once, so I don't know. I guess I'll have to rewatch it. But I think this is one that would hold up, just
Hmm.
because at the end of the day, like the Ramones music holds up over
Yes.
time. And if you're into that and you're into the
Hmm.
spirit of punk, then even the silly jokes that might fall flat down the line, you can kind of look over to really get into the music.
I just pictured the giant mouse when you said
Yeah,
that. That was the most bizarre. It's the most bizarre running gag I think I've ever seen in any
yeah.
movie.
But
Uh,
probably my favorite moment of the movie, honestly.
well, when the mouse is trying to get into the show, or which
Kind
part?
of all of just like the moment. So
The
just
whole
to fill
running.
everyone in,
Yeah.
if you haven't seen the movie, but once again, with any episode we do for this show, we highly recommend watching the movie
Yes.
ahead of time.
Watch
Just
first and then
watch first,
listen.
just
Yeah.
because we're kind of riffing on it here, and it can
Hmm.
be a little bit confusing. But there is this moment where the principal has pointed out that they've been testing rock and roll music on lab mice,
Hmm.
and the mice are having a reaction, which is kind of in the form of wearing rock and roll clothing and being kind of badass and punk. It's very fun. But then later in the movie, we all of a sudden see these mice. We see the parents of the mice, the parents of the
The
mouse,
parents of the
and the
mouse.
mouse itself as full size in mouse costumes
Hmm.
at the Ramon concerts. And for
Hmm.
me, that moment, first seeing the full size mice, was one of the funniest things I've seen in a movie. I was sitting alone watching this, and I laughed out loud at the sheer, because that's like a Monty Python,
Oh
like
yeah, that's
just
like
pure absurdism
mm-hmm.
in a movie that doesn't really have, like, it's
No,
absurd, but doesn't really have like that kind of absurdism
right.
other than that one gag running through it.
Yeah, I mean that's what's so strange about it. That and I guess blowing up the school is pretty bizarre,
Yeah.
but I do love that ending. But yeah, the mouse is yeah, it's just so bizarre. It's just and it keeps going. You know, they keep cutting back to the mouse and things like that. It's almost like someone had a mouse costume. They're like, how can we work? You know, and knowing how Roger Corman works, that actually kind of makes sense. That he would be like,
Yeah.
we have this mouse costume. Let's try to work it in the movie. Who knows?
Probably
you know?
true.
It probably
Yeah.
is. So yeah, I thought that was really funny. But going back to what you're saying, because I want to get into this a little bit. We talked, you know, we obviously this series is all about the music and the musicians. So how did the implementation of the songs and the musical sequences, how did they work for you in this film?
Oh, I thought they were great. I mean, obviously, you know, it's iconic music, which helps immediately.
Hmm.
But like you said, like, one of the great sequences was the band playing in Riff Randall's room, which I thought was a really beautiful sequence, which we referenced briefly before, where Riff Randall puts a record on and the band is all of a sudden in her room playing. You know, obviously there's a build up here
Except the
to,
drummer, he's outside.
except the drummer, yeah. There's a build up to an actual concert
Hmm.
in the film, which I always think is kind of a nice way to integrate in music movies.
Hmm.
So I thought that it was really well integrated, and I thought that it kind of created a really beautiful soundtrack to the insanity of what was going on in a way that didn't feel contrived or like it was a stretch in any way.
And there is sort of you said, like, just because you don't get to the concert until, what, probably 45 minutes into the movie.
It's
So
pretty far in.
there's like pretty good build up, you know, them mentioning the Ramones and she's the biggest Ramones fan and, you know, and then that one scene where you see them in a room. So it's a pretty good build up, I think, to the musicians. If you're not that familiar with them, I think they did a pretty good job with that. I mean, I happen to like the Ramones, like I mentioned earlier to you before we recorded, and it sounds like you do too. So just based on that alone, I think that's why I enjoy this film that much, because not that it's an amazing film or anything like that. I mean, it is enjoyable and entertaining, but the fact that the Ramones are in it, they've always fascinated me for whatever reason. I think it's partly, you know, they don't look like typical musicians, particularly Joey, the lead singer. He has such a strange everything about him, just his posture, his looks, like everything is so strange. And it's funny. Dick Miller, even, you know, he shows up in the film. He's one of Roger Corman's stock players, and he makes a comment, you know, those Ramones are ugly people. So it's like they were self-aware about it, but it's also funny because the main character and all the girls in the school are like, oh, the Ramones are so dreamy, you know. And I guess because
But there is a certain sexuality, like it's
yeah,
hard
the rock
to
and roll
explain.
element, you
The
know,
rock and roll thing, yeah.
it's-
Like there's this moment where like she talks about them eating pizza,
Mm-hmm.
and then you see them eating pizza,
Hey,
and like
pizza!
there was just something so like
Mm-hmm.
unexplainably sexual about Joey Ramone just sitting there like this greasy man eating this
Yeah.
greasy food that like shouldn't be attractive at all.
Mm-hmm.
But like I could totally see how that would be like, you know, it's
Yeah.
kind of like this rough around the edges, like just
Well,
just the sauce falling on his shirt. It's like, you
it's
know,
that rebelliousness. It's like,
yeah,
you know, these are rebels who make loud, fast music, you know.
yeah,
So that, and the whole point of the movie is that, you know, fuck the man. We're gonna
yeah.
we're
He
gonna
eats pizza the way you wouldn't want a guy coming over to your house for dinner to eat.
yeah.
You know, it's like the exact opposite of what you would want your parents to
Yeah.
think of you as being associated with.
Yeah, if you brought Joey Ramone home to your parents, you know, you probably have some explaining to do.
Yeah.
So
Well, and they lived it for sure too.
mhm. Yeah,
Ramone-
exactly. They were the real deal. That's why you know, one of the
Yeah.
reasons I like them so much.
I actually, which I don't even think I mentioned this, I have a little funny Ramones anecdote. Obviously,
Oh.
not something that happened to me personally because I was not born back then. But in the late 70s, my dad is a photographer,
Mhm.
and in the very late 70s, him and his friend Rich would go to this club in the Albany area where I'm originally from called JB Scott's, and they'd photograph tons of musicians. I think they photographed, just to name a few, I want to say like Joan Jett. They photographed who is it? Edgar Winter. But one of the bands I got to take pictures of, which probably went on to be the most famous of the bands they shot was the Ramones.
Wow.
And my dad was backstage taking pictures, and I believe it was Joey Ramone was so drunk that as my dad was trying to photograph him, Joey was trying to put his pants on, and he was just so hammered that he got tripped up in his pants and just like fell over in the middle of the dressing room and knocked stuff over. And this was
Oh my
like
God.
right after they had gotten off stage
Wow.
playing a show to a couple hundred people, and like, you know, this, so there was there this very real, visceral, like, you know, what you're seeing on screen. You know, I don't think that it's a fabricated thing. I think that they're just kind of like that, or were, I should say.
Right. It's like you said, they lived the life that, you know, or at least they did on stage, you know, and that's kind of all that matters. Like when they were on stage, you got that energy from it, and they convey that pretty well in the movie during the scene you mentioned at the concert. That's, you know, and I like, you know, I'm just a sucker for those kind of, I'm a sucker for musicals in general, and I just, so, you know, to just kind of have a point in the movie you kind of sit back and just watch the band play, like I just think that's cool, you know.
Yeah.
I always really like that. So so we touched on it briefly, but we talked about the cast a little bit. I know you were a big fan of the woman who played the principal.
Yes, Mary Woronov is the woman who played the principal. She was a frequent Corman collaborator, as was her real life husband Paul Bartel, who plays a music teacher by the name of Mr. McGree in Rock and Roll High School. And he's kind of a fun character as well because he's very into, you know, Beethoven and classical music, but also seems very hip to the rock and roll, and
He
seems
gets
kind
into
of
it. He gets
yeah,
real
he's
into it,
kind of down with whatever expression the kids want to have, as long as they're loving music and appreciating it, which is
kinda cool.
actually like kind of maybe the most timeless
Yeah.
concept in the entire movie, is this idea that like youth is going to connect to music and love it, and it doesn't matter if it's Beethoven, it doesn't matter if it's, you know, the Tommy Dorsey band, the Ramones, Kanye West, whoever. There's just always going to be this idea of youth connecting.
Right.
But
It's kind of a cool like message, actually, you know.
yeah, no, it's really positive. And they're always going to rebel against authority.
I mean, obviously he's like super corny, and but
Yeah, of course.
But the fact that the kids, you know, they actually bring him into their group and like, yeah, hang out with us, you know, it's kind of cool.
Well, and you have the feeling with him, we're getting a little on a tangent, but that's all right. You have the feeling with him a little bit, too, that maybe 20 years earlier, he would have been Riff Randall. You know, he would have been that person getting the tickets for everybody, bringing them to the show. You know, it would
Probably
have just
for a
maybe
different type of music.
a very different type of music,
That's
but
the point,
you know,
though,
the
yeah.
same kind of enthusiasm and love for the thing. But to get back to Paul Bartel and Mary Woronov, so they were frequent Corman collaborators, and Paul Bartel actually was a director as well.
Yeah, in his own right. Eating Raoul is his big claim to fame, that movie that he wrote and directed.
Yeah, and he did Eating Raoul, and then he also, which is a favorite of mine, and then he also directed Death Race 2000, which was actually
I love that movie. That's
a great movie. Features a young Sylvester Stallone in a kind of fun role.
Machine
back
Gun
in his,
Joe. Yeah.
Machine Gun Joe, back in his exploitation days. But really, really an innovative director. So if you haven't gotten to see, I would recommend both of those movies.
I actually haven't seen Eating
Raoul. Yeah, Eating Raoul.
Eating Raoul. I keep saying that wrong.
Eating Raoul is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Definitely way more intellectual than most. I don't know if that was actually a Corman movie, but you know, just to give. Actually, I don't even want to say what it's about because I can't talk about it without spoiling it.
Okay.
But very, you know, very kind of fun, very intellectual, and they had this thing. Woronov and Paul Bartel had this thing where very often they would play these intellectuals in the midst of something crazy and stupid going on. So there's this movie from the 80s called Chopping Mall, which is about these. You see it was about these killer robots who have been designed to protect a mall but start killing the people inside. And they play like these. Paul Bartel and Mary Woronov play these very concerned citizens who are just like, you know, like, oh, well, will the security work properly? And everyone just laughs it off like, you know, it's nothing. And then, of course, it doesn't. And they just kind of pop up everywhere and just have this really fun feel to them. Mary Woronov actually was featured in House of the Devil, which is a 2009 film directed by Ty West.
Yeah, I saw that
which is unbelievably scary in my opinion. I watched it alone at night, and I wish I had not. So you know, if you get some time, go look into these two because they're just amazing actors, directors, you name it.
And she's very good in this. I mean, I thought her role was. It's very one note, obviously, like everyone else's.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought she did a great job with it. And whenever she's on screen, you know, it was something to look forward to. How did you feel about PJ Souls as Riff Randall? How'd you feel about her?
I thought she was a lot of fun.
Mm.
I mean, obviously not. We're not talking Meryl Streep, believability here,
Mm.
but I think she's a fun character. She has a lot of pep.
Do you think she
Um,
pulled off being high school age? Because apparently she was much older at the time when she was.
I mean, I don't question it anymore
Yeah.
personally. You see so many movies. It's like you
Hmm.
think about like American Pie,
Yeah.
which is kind of like maybe
Hon-
the definitive high school movie of the next
mhm.
decade after the 80s, and it's
Honestly,
like
I bought it when
yeah,
before I looked it up. I was like, oh, okay, I could see
yeah.
it.
No, I mean, because when you actually see high school age kids playing high school students, we're so used to seeing older people playing high school students. So when you see someone who's 17 playing a high school senior, you're like, why is this child driving a car and, getting
Right.
into trouble? And, it's like, it doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
Um,
It is interesting that apparently in real life she had no idea who the Ramones were and was not into them at all. Like, did not like their music,
well,
which is
good for her.
yeah. Which I guess maybe she's a better actor than we think. I don't know,
Yeah,
but
no, good. I bought it. I
yeah.
believed it.
So it's kind of, but I think throughout the as she was filming, I think she got to know them personally, and I think she got on. Now I'm sure she ended up liking them a little bit more than she did.
Well, she's tied to them forever, so
Right,
whether,
yeah.
whether she likes it or not now,
Hmm.
it's like you think. I mean, obviously she's not super famous, but you think PJ Souls, and it's
Hmm.
right there,
I
rock
mean,
and roll high school.
she's with the band of the moment, and it's like you were saying earlier, how it's kind of a timeless idea, and if this film was made now, I mean, who do you think would be, who would be the
Ooh,
artist or musician that would be featured in it?
that's
Who
tough.
would,
I mean, because I don't think it would be rock and roll,
no,
and that's the challenge. And I also think that because rock and roll is such a specific moment, it's kind of tough because a lot of the music now, because rock and roll filled this space where it wasn't really so much about this intellectualized thing, it was more about an energy. But a lot of the music that fills that kind of space culturally now is pop music
Hmm.
more than rock and roll. But I don't see any pop artist necessarily being able to command like anyone who just does pop. I could see maybe a Beyonce or a Kanye West or a Childish Gambino, but the difference is a lot of them in their music put a lot more they have a lot more cultural critique. It's a lot more intellectual.
Hmm.
So like the kind of devotion I feel like the students organizing things now, it would all be through Facebook if they all wanted to
right, obviously, yeah.
go to a concert together or some other social media. And B, I think that it would be more of like an intellectual thing where rather than banging their heads and thrashing around and burning the school down, it would be a lot more like how can we enact change within the school?
Yeah,
So it's just so of the moment. It's hard to place how it would even work now.
that's interesting. Yeah, modern musicians, while they have charisma, they have presence. It's not the same. You're right. Back then, it was almost like the artists were more one dimensional, but
Yeah,
but it not in a necessarily bad way. Like I think the Ramones are maybe one dimensional in a very good way.
yeah. It's kind of
Yeah,
almost like Freudian.
right.
It's like
They
they're this explosive id
mhm,
monster that's just
yeah,
gonna do what they do.
and they stand out and they do their thing, and yeah, it's but yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like a lot of artists today are more, I guess, nuanced, and they try different
Yeah.
styles, and they're calling on more they're inspired by lots of different things. So yeah, it would definitely be I think harder to do now. I think it would, like you said, it would be a completely different movie.
Who do you think
Um,
it might be if you were to pick kind of one musician?
Honestly, the first one I thought of was Kanye, but it's probably because you
Kanye.
just mentioned him.
I would say maybe do you listen to Tyler the Creator at all or Odd Future?
Not really, no. But
Odd
I'm
Future,
aware
they
of
have a
him.
little bit of a punk vibe, and
Mhm.
and they kind of actually they have this kind of cultish thing because they make their own clothing,
Mhm.
and there is almost this weird cult like
Mhm.
thing surrounding the whole Odd Future, but it's not quite to the level of
No, and Beyonce,
slavish
like even
devotion.
that would be interesting too. But I don't know. It just it wouldn't be the same.
Hmm.
And maybe just part of that is just because times have changed, and
Yeah,
I think a movie like this, obviously would never be made again. I feel pretty confident in saying that. I think
yeah,
it's just unlikely to ever happen. To be this surface and this kind of like fun and silly without like we said, there's a couple of messages going on, but it's not really that concerned with it. It's more just off the wall kind of, what can we put in here,
yeah.
let's make a cheap movie that features a popular band. That's kind of what it is. And
Hmm.
yeah, I think for better or worse, I think it's going to stay at that time. But it's a great
Yeah.
reflection of the time. I mean, if you watch this, you feel like you're in 1979 is when they filmed it.
1979, 80, yeah.
Yeah, which kind of rounds out our series here because we were talking about through the 60s and the 70s. So, do you have any thoughts on that? You know, kind of ending this the series and the, you know, do you have anything you want to discuss about the artists? I wanted to also ask you, like, you know, we talked about the movies being sort of autobiographical in a way for the artists. I mean, do you feel like that happened at all in this one, or...
I feel like it is to some extent, but not in a direct. I feel like it's interesting because you look at each artist, and I feel like the way the movies functioned is kind of how they present their ideas. So, you know, you look at something, well, with the exception of the Monkees, because obviously the way they did that movie was a total departure from everything else they did with Head. But, you know, you look at the Beatles, and it's like the music is at the forefront. It's really about the music, but you still get the personality of this band shining through. You know, they're still there. Then you look at the Who, and it's like the music is obviously at the forefront, but it's presented in a much more abstract way. It's kind of this larger than life thing. And then you look at the Ramones here, and like I feel like it's autobiographical in a way where we're getting the feeling of what their life is like through the movie. We're not necessarily getting a beat by beat, you know, this is where they're from, this is what they're going through at the time. But I feel like we are getting the gut feeling of what it would be like to be a Ramone in high school. You know, I would imagine listening to like, you know, all those great rockabilly bands of the 50s and the early 60s. That kind of grew into what they became.
I do feel like this film, out of all the other ones, is more about how people perceive the musicians rather than, because the other films, you know, you get a little more intimate with each member and you get to know them on a certain level, whether it's, you know, how they want you to know them or not. But you get to, you know, spend some time with them. Like, you know, the first movie where we talked about A Hard Day's Night with the Beatles, you know, you get these intimate scenes of them just kind of hanging out and talking. Like, there's nothing like that in this film, really. And it's more how, you know, the aura that was around the Ramones and how people perceive them and the excitement, you know, which is cool. It's different. It's a different kind of way to look at it. Because even though the Ramones, the members themselves, are in the film, they're not in it that much, actually. I mean, I had seen it years ago and I thought they were in it a lot more than they are, actually, because like we said, they don't really show up until kind of later into the film and then obviously become a main part of it. But
it's not really their film, though.
No, it's not.
Which I think is a common misconception with this.
It's not, but it's not. But like I said, if you're into the Ramones, if you like the Ramones, I mean, I think it does make it much more enjoyable, obviously. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It's kind of more of the time, and more just like a fun movie, you know, anti-establishment kind of, you know, because like you said, the administration at the school is, you know, the principal, they basically are Nazi-esque. I mean, they're really going for that vibe.
I think that the principal actually uses the words, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure she actually uses the words like final solution or something like that at some point, like that directly. So they're not even, she's dressed in this kind of like green, gray, like they're not trying to hide the fact that she's basically a Nazi. Like it's pretty out there.
Yeah, they really go for it.
How do you think, so as we're kind of wrapping up here, how do you think, because I know I have some ideas, how do you think that this film will hold up long term moving forward, and kind of what influence, like what do you see from this in today's culture?
Man, that's tough. There really isn't anything like it, you know, like we just tried we just racked our brains to try to think of how they could even recreate this. And it's crazy because in this age of reboots and rehashing of like every idea ever, I really can't picture it. I can't picture them doing anything like this now. And I don't know. It's just so of its time.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if they answered your question.
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking because for me, like I don't think you could do anything like this now, but I think that the influence is maybe further reaching than we would even notice. And without, you know, being pretentious here, I think what I would say ended up coming from this is something I would call like the Converse aesthetic almost, where like you see these ads for kind of Converse shoes and almost like skate culture and all of that. And I feel like I'm not sure that those things are sold the way they are today
Mm-hmm.
without this movie.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
No,
like
that makes sense. Yeah.
you see like those ads where it's like the band playing and kids
Yeah.
running around spray painting walls, and it's like it's a newer it's a newer form of it,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of like that
Mm-hmm.
rebellion and that rough around the edge
Mm-hmm.
attitude that's so popular
Mm-hmm.
right now, particularly in clothing, in fashion. I feel like we might not have had without this movie, and I'm not sure the music on its own would have done it.
It's strange because there's a certain catering to what the taste of the day, you know. So it's like the Ramones are a
Mm-hmm.
popular band. We want to get in on that. We want to get the kids into the theater, you know. So there's that aspect to the film, which, you know, take that for what it is. You know, business is business. Filmmaking is a business. And Roger Corman was obviously very good at what he did.
Yeah,
You know,
very good.
so there's that aspect of it. But then there's also, like you said, like we talked about earlier, the timeless message of kind of, you know, the music of the day, and kids are going to be into whatever they're into. You know, it doesn't matter. It's cool that they're into something, you know, that they're passionate about something. And that message is really great. And also just the anti-establishment, you know, speaks to me. I don't know if it speaks to, you know, it's just
Yeah,
kind of
totally.
like, you know, why not, you know, damn the man. Like, yeah,
That's radical,
that,
man.
yeah. So those aspects of it are kind of timeless, and, yeah, it's just kind of elevates it a little bit more than it, you know, it could have been really, you know, shallow, you know, it could have
Yeah.
been not something to even talk about, but I feel like it is worth checking out, you know. I do feel like that. Do you
Yeah, I
feel?
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so that was Rock and Roll High School, and that's going to conclude our series Rock and Reel, and I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to it. We'll be back next time with a brand new series. We are discussing one that we feel pretty good about, we're pretty excited about, called Lo-Fi Sci-Fi, which we're looking forward to digging into. So thank you very much for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes and Podbean, as well as on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. All right, that's going to wrap it up, and this has been Cult Movie Cult. Until next time, so long from the other side.